for being here this afternoon. So I'm extremely honored to introduce our speaker of EMBO Global Lecture. I think this is serious. So this speaker, as you can see, is Frank Bradke. I hope my pronunciation is not too terrible. Okay, so he is currently the supervisor or is a senior group leader at the DZNE. I think it's a German Center for Neurodegenerative Disease, and so-called DZNE. I think DZ means Deutsches Zentrum für Neurodegenerative, something like this. Erkrankungen. I still remember my German. Yeah. Okay, and he is also the full professor at University of Bonn, right? And he completed his PhD at EMBO, is a European Molecular Biology Laboratory at Heidelberg. I think that's in 1999. And then after postdoctoral research at UCSF and Stanford, right? And so he became head of junior research group at DZNE, right? Or no, it's wrong. It's at Max Planck Institute, where he became a junior leader at the Max Planck Institute of Neurobiology at Martinsried in Germany. I try to memorize your CV. Okay, and so after that, he also became a senior group leader at this new institute, DZNE, and also the full professor of the University of Bonn. I think that's since 2011, right? You become full professor. And so in addition to holding the highest this kind of faculty position, I think he also received a lot of numerous awards, and there are too many to mention. I just mentioned one. It's called a Leibniz Prize, because I know this prize very well. My PhD supervisor, Peter Jonas, and Hannah Moye, they all got this Leibniz Prize. And I just remember in the same year, I nominated my PhD supervisor, Peter Jonas, to come to Taiwan. I nominated him for this 聪明度 Prize. And then in the same year, he also got this Leibniz Prize. And that's the most prestigious and biggest prize in Germany. So he talked to the secretary, Barbara. Oh, now this 聪明度 Prize is really a peanut, but I need to fly to Taiwan. So because our 聪明度 Prize is 150, 1,050,000. So this is Taiwanese dollar. It's not euro. And in your case, I think it is 1 million or more than 1 million euro. 2.5 million euros. You see, and that's for 1 year, right? For a long time, really. Wow, that's amazing. So a lot of money. So, and he is also elected a member of this German Academy of Science. It's called Leopoldina, right? And also the member of this European academy, I think it's called Academia Europea, something like this. Okay, so and his research is mainly focused on mechanism of neuronal degeneration or regeneration, and also neuronal polarities. And so he also published a lot of papers in high-profile journals, including Science and Neurons. So today he is going to give a talk about this mechanism of axon growth and regeneration. So without further ado, let's welcome Frank. Thank you. I hope my introduction is not too bad.
Can you hear me? 1, 2. Can you hear me now? Yeah, good.
Wow, thank you very much, Tien-Chen. That is such a nice introduction also, that was really touching, so I'm really happy to be here. And before starting the talk, I really would like to mention two things. And the first one is, as you already know, so I've been here now for 1 week in Taiwan, and I have to say that I'm completely thrilled by Taiwanese science. So before there was this EMBO workshop. It was organized by Cheng Ting and by Angela Giangrande, and I really felt it's amazing how the Taiwanese science has been progressing, and this is really amazing. And in this regard, I also should say you guys are such a friendly folk. It is and so so great host. I had a wonderful time. Yeah, I think I've never been treated better as a speaker in any other country. So I really feel it's just nice to see that, and it's really wonderful to be here. So the second thing that I also just to quickly mention, so for whom of your students have heard about EMBO? Raise hands? Not a lot, right? Okay, so a few. So just that you have an idea what EMBO is about. So EMBO is a European organization. And what they try to do is to promote life science all over Europe and also in the associated countries. And the idea is really behind that they, it's basically two things. So what they want is that they want to provide instruments that scientists can interact, and that they are mobile, so that they have a certain mobility. One of these ones is, of course, the EMBO Global Lecture. The other one I already said. So they sponsor, in a very generous fashion, they sponsor EMBO workshops. Yeah, we had just one now here in Taiwan. But there are many other instruments. And I just would like also to mention they have very prestigious postdoc fellowships. For example, that if you want to go abroad to a European country, then you get from this organization, you can apply for a 2 years long-term fellowship, postdoc fellowship, which is a very generous one actually. Or you can also apply for short-term funding if you basically want to learn a technique in a different lab or so. So I think this is something up for 3 months. There are many other ways how they also foster interaction and mobility of scientists all across Europe, but also with the associated countries. And for you, I would simply just check out the webpage from EMBO. Yeah? Okay. And with this, let's start. I would assume that probably everybody here in the room is really fascinated by the features of the nervous system. And if you really think about it, I think through this complex network, so we are able to sense our environment as well as our body. We can move our muscles, we can store also imagination, we have memory, we can learn things, and sometimes we're even able to think. So all of these complex networks also requires a very sophisticated wiring, and much of this wiring is being done by the axon. And the axon has for this a very particular morphology. So they're very long, so they can basically reach the length of our own body. And at the same time, they are also very thin. So they have something like a diameter of 1 micrometer. And just to give you this, this proportions also, if you would blow up your little finger, so something of 1 centimeter, if you would make an axon of such a diameter, so this axon would then reach in proportion from here to Academia Sinica and back. Yeah, so it is really a long structure. And so what we have done over the years is that we actually developed a technique to study now the whole spinal cord as well as in the brain using whole tissue imaging. So we developed this technique a decade ago together with Hans-Uli Dott. And so it relies on the idea that you basically clear the tissue, and thereby you can then actually fluorescently label cells, and then you can basically see these cells in its complete entity. So you can look on macroscopic tissue in microscopic resolution without any histological sectioning. So at that time, so Ali Ertug, he was really the driver's seat of this project, and he also named it then 3DISCO. And I think nowadays also he's actually, so at that time he was a PhD student, so he's now a director of a research institute, and he's also developing it much further. Yeah? So he's now actually achieving also whole animals, so I think it's now called Ultimate Disco. So also people in our lab also they went on in development this further. So Andrea Tedeschi, Bert Hilton, and David Elliott, they were really instrumental to study this one now in regenerative paradigms. And I really would like also to stress that subsequently, so afterwards, then also other labs actually started to develop these techniques, including the lab of Carl Leiselot, Carol Mason, as well as Hiroko Ueda. So when I personally look onto these images, also I think what I find always stunning is, for me, the axons, they look extremely fragile. But this is actually not true. So these axons, they are actually tough guys. Because if you think about it, they actually hang out with us for the rest of our life. Yeah, so they really, they can be as old as we, so can get easily 70 or 80 years old. So if you think from this perspective, I think they are really good and preserved, and only in the case if there's a neurodegenerative disease, or if one has an injury in the central nervous system, if one has, for example, a traumatic brain injury or spinal cord injury, then axons are lost. And this is really where the trouble starts, because axons fail to regenerate in the central nervous system. And so this is actually the reason why, when you have a spinal cord injury, that you have a permanent loss of sensory sensation below the injury site, as well as you also don't have any motor control below the lesion site. And this is, of course, kept the biomedical field busy for the last 30 years, because you try now to regain any sort of regeneration capability, so that these axons start to grow out again. On the other hand, there's a very different perspective, and that actually comes from developmental biologists. Because what developmental biologists, when they see an axon, say, well, these guys are actually experts in growing, right? So they're really, really good, because initially we don't have this complex network, so we only have the neurons also that are basically formed, they're basically islands, and they have to start to be wired. And this wiring occurs, of course, that the axon needs to grow out really rapidly. And I show you here one example from Easter Alpha deal, so the latest lab member in our lab. And what you see here is a cortical slice, and you see how these axons actually grow, led by their growth cone in a very dynamic fashion. So when you look from these two different perspectives, I think it comes then also really obvious. So what you would like them to do is to say, like, okay, let's try to understand the mechanism that make an axon to grow during development. If we understand this process really well, then we would be also able to reactivate these mechanisms under more pathological conditions, such as a spinal cord injury, to elicit axon regeneration. So, interestingly, also during development, there's actually a stage where we have the axon growth versus non-growth in the same cell. That is in a process that is called neuronal polarization. So shortly after the last cell division, the neuron forms actually looks like a fried egg. This process has been beautifully described in a landmark paper by Carlos Dotti. But then what you see then is that shortly after they basically are plated also into this fried egg phenotype, they form 4 to 5 neuroids. But then only one of these neuroids starts to grow out really rapidly, and this one here will become the axon. And of course, like really one fascinating question is then to ask, so how does it come? So how is actually one axon chosen? So one neuroid is not chosen to grow rapidly, where the other neuroids are restrained from growing. Yeah, and I was personally really fascinated by this question, and therefore I joined Carlos's lab. That was at that time at the EMBO, as you already heard from James, that was a nice introduction. And the prevailing idea about how this could occur is basically like a tug of war, that all of the neuroids basically start to pull with a growth cone on the neuroid, yeah, and the one that pulls strongest becomes the axon. So it was at that time a very nice idea. It was based on a concept that Tim Mitchison and Mark Hirschner established in the field, that basically said there's this clutch-like mechanism, and that described actually how the fibroblasts or in other migrating cells, how they can actually move. What you see here is a very nice example. So you see how the actin cytoskeleton is basically treadmilling. Yeah, so you basically get this polymerization at the tip, and then the actin filaments are getting retrogradely transported. And so what now Tien-Chen and Mark Kirschner showed is then this retrograde flow is then linked to the extracellular matrix here. What is happening then is that you get that this treadmill is moving forward, a bit like a tank, right? So you basically have it now going forward, and it pulls thereby on the substrate and basically attacks the rest of the cell body behind it. So that was very interesting. However, it was clear that this cannot be the complete picture, because already Mark Bradke, in a very interesting review, he actually described that axons can grow without the actin cytoskeleton. And here, I actually was very stunned by a very interesting finding by Paul Forscher and Stephen Smith. And so what Forscher and Smith were doing is they looked on a appreciate growth concept, and I just learned also that the president here, Dr. Lin, so he is actually a postdoc from Paul Forscher also, and he made this amazing work on the myosins. I think so I was really, really happy to be here. And I think what Forscher and Smith at the time showed is this complementary distribution of the cytoskeletal elements. So you have the microtubules that form the neuroid shaft, and they actually are surrounded by actin filaments. And now look what is happening if you depolarize the actin cytoskeleton. So if you use now cytokeratin D, then the microtubules, they actually start to intrude very quickly into the area that was formerly occupied by the actin filaments. So I therefore thought like, well, could this be actually a way how you can polarize the cells? And so the idea would be that probably the actin is not really just there for pulling also, but maybe it could rather be used as a sort of way to restrain axon growth. And so imagine you have now in all of the different numerals a very dense actin network. There you would have the restraint, but then here in the future axon, the actin is very dynamic, less stable, and enables the microtubules to protrude further. Thereby you get axon formation. If this hypothesis is true, then you would expect, if you depolarize the actin cytoskeleton, instead of getting now a single axon, you wouldn't end up with a cell of multiple axons. And indeed, this is the case. So if you treat them with cytokeratin D, not just one neuroid is starting to grow, but you have actually multiple to start to grow as axon. So this worked, thereby showed basically provided to the field something like a foundation of a cytoskeleton mechanism, how neuronal polarization can occur. I think subsequently it was very nice that many labs, they worked on to understand more of the signaling upstream of that, including the lab of Pu, Franck Pelé, Josh Sainz, and also Andreas Püschel, and Kuroto Kabuchi. What I personally was at that time then very interested is the question whether we can use this growth versus non-growth to actually also better understand what is happening after an injury in the spinal cord to the lesioned axon. And so the reason that axons fail to regenerate after an injury in the central nervous system is that there are many inhibitory factors in the injured spinal cord. So you have nowadays actually more than a dozen of inhibitory factors, and every year there's a new one coming up. And so what one normally tries to make is that one tries to make the environment less inhibitory. So by neutralizing some of these inhibitory components, for example, by using functional blocking antibodies or by using digesting enzymes that basically digest some of these inhibitory factors. But I thought there could be also a very interesting approach as I said, what is actually the brake that is actually keeps the axon here on hold, where ultimately all of these different inhibitory factors converge on. And I thought that the brake that is acting here could have quite something to do with a brake that prevents the axons from actually growing here any further. And so of course ultimately what you would like to do is not just to understand the brake in an academic fashion, but you would like to manipulate it, and so that these axons now start to grow out over this inhibitory environment. But certainly this is not something that you can do alone, but for this one, a team effort is needed. And this is really the premises of our lab, the foundation of our lab. And so the first thing that we were doing is to look more closely onto the cytoskeletal elements. And so what we had learned by now is that the actin filaments, they actually regulate by restraining the microtubules from protruding. But is it that the microtubules are just passive players, or could they be much more actively involved? And indeed, Harald Witte, he showed that the microtubules in the future axon are more stable compared to the minor neurites growth form. But it's not only that, there's also a causal relation to that, because if you stabilize now also the microtubules in these neurites to the one of the axon, they also start to grow as axons. And the way how Harald was doing that is by a microtubule stabilizing drug that is in the clinic now for more than 20 years, and that is called Taxol. So Taxol at a high dose would freeze microtubule elements altogether, and this is also the way how it actually combats cancer, because you basically disrupt the mitotic spindle. But if you use a low dose, a very low dose, then you basically enable still that the microtubules grow, but they don't shrink that often anymore. And as a result, you get now these multiple axons. So microtubule stabilization is therefore essential for the polarization of neurons, so it drives neuronal polarization, but it's not only that, it actually also gives something like a landmark to the cell where the axon is. And so Susanna Gomez-Hood showed that if you cut the axon very short, then one of the other neurites can take over and can become the axon. Whereas if you cut further distally and you leave basically some of the stable microtubules intact, this one is then used as a nucleation seed from where the axon can start to grow out. This, by the way, is not only working in young neurons, but it is even working in fully mature neurons that are actually really containing synapses. And for me, it's, I think it's also so nice when you talk, for example, with Tien-Chen, and so normally about, when we think about neuroplasticity, what is usually implied also is that we think about things like long-term potentiation or long-term depression, whereas that you also see some morphological changes of the dendritic spines. But what I really want to stress here, so there's a complete different level of plasticity. Namely, you can change the functional output and the functional input if you cut the axon very short, right? So this is a bit like changing the monitor to the keyboard and vice versa. So if you challenge the neurons, they are able to do that. Okay, now we learned quite a lot about the microtubules. They can basically drive the process, and they can actually also put some pushing force. And so really the question then came thereby about, so do you really have a pulling mechanism for the axons to grow, at least also CNS axons? And so to test this, Thelma Santos and Barbara Schafran, they cultured now neurons in a three-dimensional matrix. And so what you see when you culture fibroblast is that they pull the whole time onto these collagen fibers, as you can see here. So these ones are visualized by DRC microscopy. So there is a very clear pulling, like what you would also see in a spider web. But look what is happening if you look now on the neurons also. They can actually grow their neurites, they grow and shrink, and they can also grow their axons without any deformation of these collagen fibers. And you can actually also measure the forces there in these sort of data, so with a physicist together. And there's actually, the forces are close to what they're basically background. So now that we learned that it's more like an amoebic type of movement, we asked them, so why can you not reactivate this polarization program in injured CNS axons in vivo? And there, Ali Ertug found a very interesting answer. And so what he was doing is that he cut axons in the central nervous system, and he cut axons in the peripheral nervous system, where you have normally regeneration, of course. And the system that he used are the so-called dorsal ganglion neurons, and they are a really beautiful system to study because they are part of the peripheral nervous system where axons can regenerate, but they also have an axon in the central nervous system where axons fail to regenerate. And so you could basically do on the very same cells what is happening after a different kind of injury. And what he found is that after looking on many different parameters, he was actually surprised, and me too, that there was not much of a difference. But where he did find a very clear difference was, again, on the level of the microtubules. After an injury in the peripheral nervous system, microtubules remain bundled, and they can support the axons to grow out again. By contrast, after an injury in the central nervous system, microtubules are disassembled. The few ones are left to just grow in any sort of direction. This is something that is not only found in rodent, but Yogosha showed that even if you look now in patient material, if you look now in a spinal cord injured patient that lived with a spinal cord injury for more than 40 years, that there the axons, they actually persisted at the injury site. So remember, that is something very different to a neurodegenerative disease where an axon that is once starting to degenerate would have been lost after a few months or a year. These ones persisted, but also there, the microtubules remained disassembled. So there was also causality, and so he could actually show that you can change the growing axons to non-growing retraction bulbs by microtubule destabilization using, for example, a drug that is called neuronal. But of course, the more interesting question is, can you make all of these guys here? Can you all of these ones make again growing axons? And that one seemed to be quite a challenge because, first of all, you needed to reassemble microtubules altogether. But what was thought at the time where the microtubules are actually generated are at the centrosome, the microtubule organizing center, which is the cell body. So now imagine that you have a cortical neuron, and that is basically up in the cortex, as the name says. And microtubules, they would have to be transported from here down to the injury site. So it's quite a daunting task for a neuron. Right? However, a lot of these knowledge had been extrapolated from dividing cells. And so, therefore, Michael Stiess decided to look now more closely what is going on in neurons. And indeed, what he found is that actually during neuronal differentiation, the centrosome becomes inactivated. Yeah, so it becomes inactivated as a so-called microtubule organizing center. So microtubules are not nucleated from this site anymore. But the good news was is that the microtubules could be formed anywhere in the cells in an acentrosomal way. So they could be formed in the cell body, in the dendrite, but also in the axon. That made us now, gave us a possibility that we could really ask, well, would it then be possible to use microtubule stabilizers such as Taxol to enable now the axon regeneration. The thing that made us excited about using Taxol is that it had also a second potential effect, and that is that it can reduce scarring. So Taxol is used as an anti-scarring agent in the clinics. So for example, if people receive a coronary stent, this stent is usually coated with Taxol to have any sort of detrimental effects, so simply abolish. Right? Imagine you would have a small mechanical lesion, you would have fibrotic scarring, that would be of course detrimental to the patient, right? But with a Taxol, you actually diminish that. But why is this important? I will show you when we now discussed what are the minimal requirements for axon regeneration. And also to ask this question, we actually came back to the dorsal ganglion neurons. So by now you remember that the DRG neurons, they have a central axon that cannot regenerate, and that have this peripheral axon that can regenerate. But the one thing what is really outstanding about these neurons is that this is one of the few cases where actually also the central axon can regenerate, namely after something what is called the conditioning. That is, if you first cut the peripheral axon, and afterwards you cut the central axon, you not only have regeneration on this side, but you also find no regeneration on this side here. And this was work from Richard and Issa almost 40 years ago, and that really rocked the regeneration field, yeah, because it showed for the first time that regeneration is possible. Subsequently, Simona Neumann in the lab of Clifford Wolf, she showed that these axons actually really grow also in CNS tissue. Yeah, that was another milestone. And I was really fortunate that then afterwards, Simona, she did her postdoc also in the lab of Alan Marsbaum, and I was doing also my postdoc at UCSF, and we collaborated now on the question what sort of signaling pathway can be employed to mimic this perforation. what we found is that the stimulation of the cyclic AMP pathway could do this, could recapitulate this conditioning effect. So far, so good. But the question is, so why does it not work in a clinically relevant time frame? So why does it not work in this case? And this is something pretty important, because if you imagine now, it would be almost like you drive your motorbike and then your partner tells you, but don't forget your cyclic AMP injection, right? So it would not make any sense. And so we therefore ask the question, so what is the underlying reason for that? And in principle, you can imagine that there are two problems. And the first one is, it could be a cell intrinsic problem. So it means that if you cut here centrally, that now the axons atrophy, and if you have this atrophy, that even if you perform this perforation, that the neurons cannot gain growth competence anymore. Second option is that after this injury, of course, at the beginning they would not grow, and they could start to grow after the second lesion a few days later, but something has changed so drastically already here at the lesion site, namely a scar had been formed, and thereby that these axons are simply not able to grow, even though they're growth competent, because they cannot grow through the scar. So to distinguish between this possibility, Ravna did together with Ali Ertug the following experiment. So she basically cut axons without creating a scar, right? And the way how they did it is by 2-photon laser lesions. So they cut simply small axons, and what they found now is that even in this post-conditioning, where you normally, after mechanical lesion, they actually found now the axons to regenerate. And here I show you one of these examples. So you see that the axon also in the living mouse, and if you now cut with a laser, these axons are within a few hours, this one is degenerating, whereas the neighboring are still intact. And what you see now here over the next couple of days is how this axon behaves, right? There's no growth over the next couple of days, there's a little bit of sprouting, so these neurons are growth incompetent. But if you then perform this perforation, so you gain growth competence, and you see how these axons now start to grow and to regenerate. So what these data therefore show is what are really the minimal requirements for the axons to regenerate. So you need on the one side to gain growth competence, you have to upregulate this growth program again in these neurons, and at the same time you have to reduce the scar. And I think this is where we come now to the Taxol or other microtubule stabilizing drugs, because they have now the potential to reactivate the growth program, as I showed you before, and they can also reduce the scarring. And I will show you now to illustrate you this mechanism by showing you two videos. And in the first video, I will show you now a neuron that is plated on these inhibitory factors, on this stop sign, namely on one that is called NOGO-A. And what you will see at the beginning is how the microtubules just polymerize everywhere in the cell, but then you give aprocylon B, so this one is a microtubule stabilizing drug, and it has the advantage that you can give it actually systemically because it can cross the blood-brain barrier. What you then see is how these microtubules are polymerized to the tips, and after another couple of hours you see how these tips actually, how these microtubules push against these tips and extend these neurites even on this inhibitory substrate. One thing what I really would like to stress here, so you don't see the whole microtubules, otherwise it would be an overexposed picture, but you simply just see the polymerizing tips, and that are labeled with a so-called microtubule end-binding protein 3, or in short, EB3. That is of course infused to fluorophore, in that case cherry red. What you will see now at the beginning is before treatment, you have comets just all around. There are some microtubules just basically polymerized. 2 hours later, what you see is now that the microtubules polymerize from the cell body to the tip of the neurites. Yeah, so they all went their way. And if you look then after another 2 hours, what you find is that these microtubules actually push the neurites forward. The need for the migration, they need stable microtubules in front of the cells. So this is actually work, classical work from the lab of Greg Anderson. And so now imagine what is happening if you have now aprocylon, so a microtubule stabilizing drug, all around the cells. So we have stable microtubules in the front, you have them in the back, you have them left and right. So simply these cells, they don't have then any directionality, and as a result, they cannot actually grow in a directed fashion, they cannot close a gap, they cannot go towards an injury site, whereas the control cells, they do that very easily. are the two mechanisms that enable now, when you actually treat animals with a low dose of eposilon B, D, or also with taxol, that actually you have now even functional recovery. And I should mention that the recovery goes through the serotonergic axons, and I'm happy to discuss this later further. But I would like to show you now how this functional recovery, how this one looks like. So what we perform here is a mild to modest to moderate contusion injury. And so if you would have the animals actually walking around, so you would see that they actually still walk relatively normal. But on the horizontal ladder, what you find is that actually the back paws, they slip through the rungs here. Yeah? They basically, you see that the back paws, they basically go through here. So I let the video run, you see that. Yeah, so they make all these mistakes when they walk over. By contrast, the eposilon-treated animals, so they walk actually over in a very coordinated fashion and without any mistakes. Because these data were pretty impressive, we early on shared them with other labs, namely with the lab of Armin Blesch, as well as Norbert Weidner prior to publication. And they actually showed a very similar effect in a different rat strain. So of course, we will follow up now on these sort of experiments. So we're using a more severe injury. We are also using now, instead of a thoracic injury, that we also want to look now for the cervical injury, also to really understand also whether in combination of this treatment together with rehabilitation would also enable now better recovery. So, but what I would really like now to come to is that we thought that we would be in a very good position to start to decipher the molecular machinery underlying axon regeneration. And remember how the strategy was initially, how we came to the microtubule stabilization. That was actually by studying neuronal and to understand the mechanisms underlying axon growth. And indeed, we did the very same strategy now for the next round as well. So we deciphered the molecular program that is underlying neuronal polarization. Basically, I will not go through all the different molecules as we identified and analyzed, but I really would just rather like to give you the take-home message. So first, what we try to do is that we always use the candidate polarity gene and knock it out and saw whether there would be any polarity phenotype. And so here, the gene that is called C42, these small GTPAs, there you see that these neurons have neurites, but they don't form an axon. As the next point, what you do then is that one identifies among very different and various downstream factors which is the one that is really affected. And then finally, if you really want to understand whether this is a linear cascade, you try to restore, you try to rescue the phenotype by overexpressing mutants that are basically active or so on, and see whether this manipulation is sufficient to rescue axon growth. This was work done by Dorothy Neukirchen, Brian Gabeloff, Sabina Tajurovic, and also Sebastian Dupras. And what, and as I said, so we are not going through all of the molecules, but I basically want to give you now here as a take-home message that what we found is that there's nothing like a canonical polarity pathway. So it's not just going through the Lin signaling or the catenin signaling, but indeed what we found is it seems that there are many different ways of how you can polarize now a neuron, but ultimately they either make the microtubules more stable or they make the actin filaments less stable and more dynamic so that the microtubules can actually protrude through here. So what I will do now is that we zoom in onto one of these molecules, namely cofilin, and just to show you how we can use this knowledge now in a translation to understand better what is going on after spinal cord injury and whether we can induce axon regeneration. And so the way how we did that is that Kevin Flynn, he analyzed what is going on during this transformation from a neuroblast, where the cell is round, looks like this right egg phenotype, and then that these neurons now start to form neurites, and become a neurite-bearing cell. So a very drastic morphogenetic transformation. And what he found is that cofilin, what it does is that it actually severes here the actin filament. So it's a bit like this Pac-Man, and it basically cuts off the actin filaments, it frees space, and thereby now microtubules, they can actually enter into the space that is formerly occupied by the actin filaments, and thereby they start to form neurons. And if you look at this one, here you have still the actin filaments. They're very, very dense, but what is happening is that directly below, there the actin filaments disappear, and microtubules now start to enter, right? So this is a process that is occurring during neuronal development. But interestingly, in the adult nervous system, so the actin filaments are extremely static. And also, if you look on cophylline is inactivated. Yeah, it is actually not, so you really try to suppress its dynamicity. Therefore, our question was, would it be then sufficient to dynamize the actin cytoskeleton again, and also to enable thereby the microtubules to protrude through to induce axons to regenerate? Yeah, that was, I think, quite a challenging task, and I was really fortunate that students and postdocs teamed up to address this question. There was really, 5 people that were really the driving force. That was Barbara Schafran, Michele Coccio, Andrea Tedeschi, Sebastian Kupas, and Claudia Laskowski. And I don't have time here now to tell you all of the different details, but I really would just like to zoom in on one of the most important results that they found. That they showed that after spinal cord injury, so if you had cut the axon, but if you now express cophylline 1, so remember this Pac-Man, then this one is sufficient to dynamize the actin cytoskeleton. By this actin dynamicity, now these axons actually can grow through the injury site. So we knew now that by a single manipulation on the effector level of the actin cytoskeleton, we induce axons to regenerate. And so we therefore then of course asked, well, maybe we are now actually in the position that we can decipher a whole signaling cascade that suppress the axons to regenerate. Tina Stern and Bert Hilton, they were doing this work. And really, this is just to remind you where we started off. To remember what I told you is that we said, like, well, what is actually the brake that is acting here in the growth cone, in the indent axon, where ultimately all of the different inhibitory factors actually, or signaling components, converge on. And nowadays, one knew quite a bit about the different pathways. So one used ligands. So as I told you, we have now 12, 15, every year there's a new one coming up. One knows also quite a bit about the receptors. But interestingly, much of the signaling converged onto a small GTPase, namely that is called RhoA. But it is still unclear what is downstream of RhoA. So what is really the pathway that can basically then mediate the brake? And that is nothing only of academic interest, but actually Lisa McCarricker, with her beautiful work, she used the bacterial toxin that inactivates RhoA to try to induce axon regeneration. And that worked actually really well. And they also tried, therefore, to translate it in the clinic with spinal cord injured patients. However, the trials, they were basically then stopped because these patients, they did not show an improved recovery after such a treatment with a so-called CESVIN or the C3 exoenzyme. And the more we actually thought also it is actually important that we should look now in detail, so what could be the underlying reason? Is it really something also that is related also to the neurons? Could there be also another cell type that is actually a problem? And so therefore Tina Stern generated a mouse where RhoA is inactivated but genetically abated in the nervous system. What you can see then is that these neurons they have a different response to inhibitory factors. So normally in the wild type you see upon CSPGs you have this actin condensation, this compaction, and the microtubules are starting to become retracted. And this effect is RhoA dependent because in the absence of RhoA here, this knockout neurons, so the actin cytoskeleton remains not there, and the microtubules do not retract. So here again, you see in the wild type this compaction, yeah, you get this stop signs, these inhibitory factors, and you see this actin compaction, and the microtubules, they grow back, whereas in the knockouts, this occurs not. So there was now a complete cascade also from this inhibitory substrate to RhoA activation, you have this compaction, and then you have basically thereby these microtubules that are restrained. So, but how can this compaction, how can this be mediated? again, we learned actually something from the polarization, because Sebastian Dupras actually showed that rho A, what it does during neuronal development is that it helps with the execution of the polarity program. Namely, normally when an axon grows, so it grows, and then this axon stops, yeah, and also to sense in other environmental cues, then it starts to grow again, then it stops. If you ablate rho A, the axons just continue to grow, yeah, without a break. What Sina now showed, that's the very same effect, namely also through these actin arcs, is also happening after an injury. And you see what is happening is rho A, what it normally does, it forms through an actin motor that is called myosin 2, these actin arcs. And thereby, now the microtubules, they are basically restrained through these actin arcs. And here, Sina showed that exactly the same cascade through rho A, myosin 2 activation, we actually put the microtubules on hold. So from this perspective, ablation of rho A is a great thing, yeah, because thereby you induce regeneration. But what Sina in her genetic analysis showed that there's actually a counteracting effect on the level of the astrocytes. Because what is happening, what she showed is happening is that you ablate rho A, that you have a reactive gliosis, so you get a overscarring, and thereby you prevent actually these axons to regenerate. So that one is actually a pretty important result, because over the last 5 years there has been an important discussion in the field whether clear scarring is actually good or bad for axon regeneration. And by having now identified a molecular suppressor of the clear scarring event, so actually this lot of discussion could be actually solved. So what this data therefore show is you need actually either only ablate rho A in the neurons, but not in the astrocytes, where it actually has an important effect. Or you can also go further downstream, right? Where you look on the signaling cascade, where something also that is only effective on the neuronal side, but not on the astrocytes. And actually, if you look onto this cascade, you find that the microtubule protrusion seems really a defining element between the two. Yeah, so this one is a distinguishing factor. And indeed, when in former studies, Farida El-Al and Yevrushel, they did show that if you treat animals with tacrosol or hydrosilon, you don't actually have an effect on the clear scar, so you only reduce the fibrotic scar. So I show you now here a video how this one actually looks in the spinal cord with this tissue imaging technique. And what you see is after spinal cord injury, the axons in the wild type neurons actually stop at the injury site. This looks very similar also after an injury in now the nerve system where rho A is completely ablated. Yeah, so both in the astrocyte and in the neurons. Things become even worse when you ablate rho A only in the astrocytes. Yeah, so they actually stop short, and you see that some of these axons actually start now even to turn around or something. Yeah, so they basically even make a U-turn to get rid of, avoid this area. And only when you ablate now rho A in the neurons alone, then you find that these axons actually start to cross the injury site. And so I think what is important also about this point here is that if you really start to think about any sort of treatments, maybe you have to really study always side by side what is the effect of your proposed treatment on the different cell types that are involved. Yeah, so a spinal cord injury is also a bit like an ecosystem, and you cannot simply just have an effect on one or two of these ones. Yeah. Okay, so I told you so much about that in development, axons are great, also growing, but then later they stop to grow. But of course, the question is then, so why is it like that? So why do neurons lose their growth competence when they mature? And of course, we should not ask any why questions also normally in science, but I think sometimes it really helps also to understand things a little bit better. And actually from here, you can get a very interesting answer. That is, during development, axons may be also losing their growth potential because they would simply overshoot their target, right, which would lead to misfiring. So remember, so the axon here initially would start to grow, if basically they start to make synapses that would continue to grow, that would be misfiring, right? Whereas, but this has of course a side effect. If you have here some kind of injury, that the neurons are still in this growth incompetent state. So if therefore there would be something like a growth suppressor that would be somehow related that the cells have reached the target and synapse formation should be switched on, then you would expect that such a growth suppressor should be initially downregulated, but then later becomes upregulated. But are there any hints that such a whatever electric activity or synaptic transmission mechanism could actually work? And actually, there is very classical work from the co-indicator. What they showed is that electric activation puts at least snail sensory neurons on hold. And what Joanna Ene showed, that a very similar mechanisms also works in adult DRG neurons. So if these ones are stimulated, they actually stop now to grow, and you can basically, after the stimulation, they start to grow out again. What Bill Hilton showed that a similar mechanism also works really in vivo. So after spinal cord injury, when he now silenced the dorsal ganglion axons here in the central nervous system, this was actually sufficient to make these ones to grow. And actually, the silencing is also part of the conditioning lesion. If you're interested in that, I'm happy also to discuss this further later on. But the interesting point also from Joanna's work is that you actually can restore growth by actually inhibition of transcription. So if you depolarize the cells, remember, so they stop to grow, they don't make an axon, but if you at the same time, you also now inhibit the transcription of new genes, so they basically rescue the phenotype. And that actually shows that there's normally a growth suppressor that should be upregulated. Yeah, but what could be such a suppressor? So based on Joanna's data, Andrea Tedeschi performed now a screen. And with the way how he did it, he used again the DRG neurons, and he used many different experimental paradigms where either neurons are growth competent or growth incompetent. And he basically compared them side by side. He performed all this RNA sequencing, and a subsequent bioinformatic analysis came out with 5 candidate genes, of which one of these genes was a gene encoding a voltage-gated calcium channel subunit that is called alpha-2 delta-2. And I think alpha-2 delta-2 was really interesting for us because this one is actually known to be a synaptogenic gene, because Charla Erobu, when she was in the lab of the late Ben Barres, she showed that this one is actually synaptogenic. And so, of course, as this one is a suppressor of axon growth, a potential suppressor of axon growth and regeneration, you should inhibit this one. This is actually possible through gabapentinoids such as pregabalin and gabapentin, and indeed Andrea Tedeschi found now axon regeneration. But Andrea Tedeschi then subsequently also in his own lab showed that this treatment gives also functional improvement after spinal cord injury and even after stroke. That has been also independently recapitulated by the lab of gabapentinoid. Yeah, and obviously that one has also quite some implication about clinical treatments, and we come to this in a moment, but I really would like to stress here that we are still in the infancies to understand how synapse formation and axon growth, how they're actually related to each other. So this one is still actually unclear, and so there's a lot to be still studied. And I think the first important step, though, was now done by Bradke, and that he actually showed recently that if you ablate components of the synaptic vesicle priming machinery, that this one is actually sufficient to induce axon regeneration. And he could recapitulate the effect by pharmacological treatment, namely with the drug baclofen. Okay, so we have now 3 drugs that are already in the clinics, right? We have the levocylons, we have baclofen, we have also the gabapentinoids, like gabapentin and pregabalin. So is there any indication that this one could also then work in the clinic? So we early on shared our data prior to publication with the EMSCI network. And the EMSCI is a consortium of 20 spinal cord injury clinics all over Europe. And they looked, based on our data, then in their their files, so they have a wonderful patients' data. What they found is that actually patients that received pregabalin or gabapentin early on, so within the first 30 days after the spinal cord injury, that they were associated with a better functional improvement, with better functional recovery. They also found similar interesting data also for baclofen. So this is by no means clinical trials, this is only meta-analysis. Also, but this one also brings us to the point that we can now really ask, can we eventually translate our findings? And again, here, I really would like to stress this not can be done by a single person, it can also not be done by a single team. But for this one, you need basically a wider group of people. And of course, the main drivers there are the clinicians. Okay, what I would like to offer you instead of a summary, and I think you're all very smart people anyway, so I don't have to go about all the different things or so, but I just would like to give you, as a reminder, what basically the idea was behind it. It was simply to say, like, okay, let's try to understand how neurons polarize. So what are these mechanisms that make an axon to start to grow? We felt if we understand these mechanisms, then we can only always employ these mechanisms to elicit axon regeneration. And there's still a lot to be learned, and I think I just had my lesson during that time or so by the work from Bradke. In our lab, we just published a few weeks ago a paper where he basically transformed our understanding of the microtubules. Like initially, what I think the whole field always thinks also that the microtubules are something like stable pillars, right? So they're bundled, and they're basically there, and they can polarize and shrink a bit at the end. You have sometimes single microtubules that can also, of course, also be moving. But what Max showed is that these pillars, they're constantly moving backwards. Yeah, so it's basically like the microtubules, these pillars are moving the whole time on the ground. And only in the axon later on, so actually this movement stops to grow and actually helps to polarize the cells. Yeah, so it was something that actually has quite some implication. First, of course, for neural development, but also, if you think about it, for axon regeneration and degeneration. Another one that is for me still very hard to grab as a concept, if you think about polarization a little bit more, so it drives you bananas, yeah, because if you think about it, so all of the pyramids have the potential to grow, but just one makes it. But how does basically this view right now, oh, this guy is growing here, and I should not grow, so what is going on there? So I'm thinking, I'm a slow thinker, and I've been thinking about this now for more than 20 years. And you will hear now also from Tien-Chen Lin also that he found some very interesting answers to that also, and yeah, that I never thought also would be possible. But there are many other questions also, yeah, that I really would like to, this is a very fresh field that is currently going on. And I really would like to use this opportunity to thank all the people of our lab. As you know, this is really a team effort. I'd like to thank really the present members of the lab, but also the past members, many of which now made their academic careers, are now famous directors, professors, group leaders, and so on. But I also would like to stress that actually around half of them, they went to industry. Yeah, this is usually also not said also on the digital side, but I have to say also these people also they made really wonderful careers. And we had a meeting, I think when you mentioned this Leibniz Prize, so the first thing that I did with the money was to organize an alumni meeting to get everybody together, because it's of course their prize. And so we had a good party, we had a nice talks. And what came also out that the people that made an academic career, they were super happy, but also the happy were the people that are in the industry. I think it's really depends on you, so how people make their decision, and it was good to see that everybody made the right one. Yeah, and I would like also to take this opportunity to thank all of our collaborators. I think some of these projects really required heavy lifting, and we would not have been able to do it alone. And so thanks for that, and I'd like to thank our funding sources. Yeah, and of course I would like to thank you for your attention. I would just to mention also, so I had to write, so I gave a plenary lecture very recently at SFN. For this, I had to write something like a review that covers the whole lecture. So yeah, just put you this one in. Yeah, that's it. We're done.
I believe you also enjoyed this very exciting talk. So now let's open for questions. Q&A. Students? Or
you need the $10.
from your warning.
I don't know.
Any question?
Not everybody at once.
Oh, yeah, please.
Professor, I would like to ask a question. You just mentioned that the scarring will inhibit the axon regeneration, right? But why? What's the mechanism behind this?
So first of all, I really should stress that I don't think it's like a general feature, like that you can do it for all of the neurons, but that it's actually part of the conditioning. And so if you think about this conditioning effect, right? Remember, so you cut peripherally, and then basically you induce axon regeneration. And so what we thought is possible, that is this electric activity could be the suppressive signal. Remember, so those ganglion neurons, they are proprioceptive neurons. And so what they do is they get information as a form of action potential from the muscle spindle. And so what our idea is that these action potentials say something like, hey, don't grow, you're still connected. Hey, don't grow, you're still connected. But once they're silent, so then the signal is gone. And then these axons need to start to grow out again.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks for your wonderful talk. And I'm wondering, since you found some way to let the neuron regenerate, but how do you know that if you improve its regeneration, it truly can wire in the correct way?
Yeah. So I actually know that they don't grow in the correct way. And so I think this is something very important, because 20 years ago, some people really believed like, so they grow there and then turn right or so at the right point. But actually many of the axon guidance factors, they're actually downregulated, so they're not there anymore. So this is bad news. Yeah, they say, well, why are you doing all that? The good news, though, is that there has been several studies some time ago by Regeneration, as also by Martin Schwab. They showed that these axons, when they make synapses, these are basically artificial targets that never being used normally, but that the spinal cord is smart enough to actually self-organize and to use this information now and to transform this information into something useful. Also. Yeah, so there's an enormous plasticity that also involved in the cortex also to use really this sort of information, but this is possible.
Sharing us your beautiful work. You just showed us that you grow the neuron on the fibroblast. This is a meninges fibroblast, I guess. So in vivo, do they grow along the meninges? I mean the axon regeneration, do they prefer to grow along the meninges or the bloodstream, or they just grow wherever they want?
Yeah, so there's something, you know, I was struggling with that a lot, because if you think about, if you saw the staining, so these were actually laminin stains, yeah. And so when I use cell culture, and so neurons love to grow laminin. I said, what is going on here? But these meningeal fibroblasts, they are inhibitory to regenerating axons. Yeah, so it's not that they basically grow them along the meninges, but they're really inhibitory, because they secrete inhibitory factors, also CSPGs, for example, and they also form a matrix where other cells, such as also the astrocytes, deposit the inhibitory factors in. Yeah. And there's now a paper coming out soon, I think I heard it at Cold Spring Harbor, that actually also showed that something similar apparently goes on during development. They will, you basically will see that that certain neurons, when they actually grow onto fibroblasts, they actually repelled from growing. And so basically our experience from the cell culture with laminin is always good. Yeah? And I had, you know, like when I saw these results, I had with Farida a lot of discussion here because laminin is permissible. No, in vivo it's different. So, yeah. But I think the important point for you is that the fibroblasts as well, it's not just that they make these permissive factors, but they make also a lot of inhibitory factors. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the excellent talk. I would say the point of view is very cytoskeletal oriented. Just wondering, the organelle, like mitochondria, follow the path of your cytoskeleton growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, there's really a beautiful work on the mitochondria on Axon Regeneration that has been actually shown over the last year that actually the mitochondria and also the energy supply, metabolism also plays an important role. You know, like I have a small lab, you cannot basically work on everything also, but clearly they form an important role.
Very good. So I'm very interested in the effect of pregabalin.
Yeah.
So I think you probably know this. Pregabalin is an FDA-approved drug for fibromyalgia and also for chronic disorders. And normally in this chronic pain disorder, there is upregulation of this alpha-2 delta-1 and alpha-2 delta-2, and that's the reason treating patients with pregabalin can alleviate the chronic pain. So in your case, do you think in these external injuries, there is any upregulation of alpha-2 delta-1, and then if you apply this pregabalin, and then you can inhibit this voltage-gated calcium channel, and then you can suppress. You can improve the outgrowth.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think exactly what you now illustrate also, what you described also, this is a cascade that we are also thinking. And so in a way, what I often use also as an example, so you guys know Ulysses, the story of Ulysses? It's an old saga, a Greek saga. And so the idea is, it's a guy that won a war, but basically the gods were really not angry about him and said like, well, you have now to go on a long road, and he had to make many adventures. One of which was that he had to encounter the sirens. Sirens, super nice people, or women that basically sing. And so the sailors, usually what they do is they listen to that, but then they are getting eaten up or so on because they're starving to death. So he knew about this, and so when they came to that area, he gave to all of the sailors now these wax for the ears, yeah, that they cannot hear, and so then they went through. And I think in principle, this is something very similar how we think about this one. So you have this injury, you have actually an upregulation of alpha-2, delta-2, and if you then afterwards then see what is going, they're even synaptic-like structures and so on. And what we think is how pregabalin is doing it, basically releases this sort of communication. Yeah, so it's a bit like the wax in the ears, and that now the axons actually cross through.
Any more questions? Oh, yeah, we have.
Thank you for your sharing. And I was wondering, because from your work, you focus on the more on the injury, right? And I was wondering something about the degeneration, because this is a process that we maybe, because you have mentioned some several treatment, and whether this treatment are able to stop the retract of the neuron or the axon or the neurite. Yeah, this is my question.
So I just repeat, so basically you said, can this sort of knowledge what we have there also tell us more about the degeneration events? Did I get it correctly?
Yeah, because from the injury, just like a shortcut.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I think this is also one of the question also that I had here. I think in principle, the field, so a lot of things that we are seeing in spinal cord injury, you see this degeneration. And this is a bit like a time-lapse movie, so it goes very fast compared to what is happening in a neurodegenerative disease. And so this one, you have certainly an advantage. And I think one thing, for example, also microtubule stabilization had been also discussed as a treatment for Alzheimer's. So there were drugs from the GNLE, of course, you know, like this tau hyperphosphorylation. So it could very well go in this direction. And one thing, what I really would like to stress, I think the cool thing about, we can probably also go it here with this time point 0, with the CNS injury. The problem with neurodegenerative diseases, you don't have a time point 0. You don't know when the disease really starts. Yeah. So is it 10 years before you have the symptoms? Is it 15 years, or is it just 5 years? You don't have an idea. The cool thing about spinal cord injury, there's no discussion about time point 0. Yeah, time point 0 is this one. Yeah. And thereby, because you have this definition, you can then actually ask different questions, so you understand what is coming first. Yeah. And just to make really one statement, I would argue, I hope this is not coming to the video still also, but if you think about a better, the discussion and axon degeneration, so these are things which are where it's not clear what is the temporal relation and the causal relation. That is really a problem. So maybe you have the A-beta deposits, but you have first also some sort of axon degeneration process. So, yeah. With a spinal cord injury, there's no discussion what comes first.
Okay. So if there is no more question, let's think front again. And we have another short talk by Tien-Chen Lin. I don't know whether you want to have a little move, just because there is I think, do you want to take a break and move a little bit, or we can continue? Okay, so if you want to go to the restaurant, just do it. Come back in 5 minutes. Now let's move on to the next session. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our anonymous, right? So Dr. Tien-Chen Lin graduated from our Department of Life Sciences in 2005. I think that's DZNE. I already checked for you. And then I think he studied biochemistry and molecular biology, also at our Institute of Biochemistry. And then he moved to study PhD in University of Heidelberg, and he got his PhD degree with magna cum laude. This is a very high distinctions, and so he got the degree doctorate from 2014. And then, by the way, he published 3 excellent papers during his PhD, including his eLife paper. And then he continued to work as a postdoc in Frank's lab in German Center for Neurodegenerative Disease. So his research interest is about the convergence of molecular neurobiology, cytoskeleton, and mechanical sensation. So today I think he is also going to give a very interesting talk. So Dr. Lin. Tien-Chen.
Hi, thank you very much for Tien-Chen's kind introduction. So, 我叫林天正. So yes, I was an undergraduate and a master degree student in Yangming University. So it's really nice to be here again after so many years doing research abroad. So my research focus in Frank's lab is about the neural polarization. So in the conventional view, we know the things that the neural polarization is mainly about the axon formation. And as a growth cone, we are all very actin structure we're all familiar with. Since it drives the neural elongation and therefore axon formation, growth cone has also been considered as the main machinery driving the neural polarization. So with this presentation, I'm going to show you that actually the neural polarization is dictated by the wholesale actin networks. And in these actin networks, the actin branching and the ectomyosin, they play exactly opposite roles in neural growth and axon formation. And then their interactions establish a local excitation, global inhibition systems, ensuring single axon formation. So, neural polarization starts with the formation of a multiple minor neurite, and eventually one of the neurite will become the axon, and the remaining neurite will develop as a dendrite. Then their interaction forms the synapse and determines the direction of electrical and chemical signalings. However, to ensure single axon formation, this will require both positive and negative regulatory factors of neurite growth. And theoretical modeling predict that the interactions between positive and negative regulators will establish a local excitation, global inhibition system explaining the neural polarization. And very interestingly, more than 30 years ago, a hallmark paper by Klaus Doty and Gary Bunker, they detailedly described the neural polarization in vitro. And they found that actually, at this very early stage of neural polarization, neurite growth is not a straightforward elongation process. Actually, you can see that the neurite growth constantly switches between the extension and retraction activities. Then the question here is, what could be the factors mediate this positive and negative regulation of neurite growth, and how do they interact to ensure single axon formation? So to address this question, I simply start with acquiring the live cell videos of the early stage neuron. So from this video, one can clearly see that indeed, the neural growth at this early stage of polarizing neuron is not a straightforward elongation process. You can see that it seems that the retraction and extension activities are randomly displayed by each neurite. So to find out if there's any relationship between this extension and retraction activity, I extract the neurite velocity profiles over time and then separate them into the extension profile and retraction profile. And then I apply the cross-correlation analysis to quantitatively describe the temporal relationship between extension and the retraction. And the result shows that the acceleration of the neural extension would simultaneously suppress the retraction velocity of those retracting neurite and vice versa. And this is reflected by this negative correlation peaks here. In addition, you can also see that there are two symmetrically distributed positive correlation peaks. This indicates that actually the neural extension and retraction activities, there are two oscillating phases in a neuron. They are not just two activities randomly displayed by each neurite. And such a neural growth oscillation is very similar to the protrusion, retraction oscillations observed at the leading edge of migrating cells, as you can see here. And it has been known that such a protrusion retraction oscillation is driven by the actin reorganization. So I simply hypothesize that maybe the neural growth oscillation is driven by this very similar mechanism. So to test this possibility, I simply extract live act in the neuron. So live act is a small probe which can specifically bind the actin filament. So in this video of a neuron expressing a live act, one can see that the actin in the neuron is highly dynamic. And such actin fluctuations are mostly driven by 3 types of actin structures. First, you can observe that there are numerous actin patches in the soma, with the intensity constantly fluctuating with time. And second, you can observe that there are actin waves constantly, periodically fired at the soma. And then it's translocate along the neural shaft. Once it's arrived at the neural tip, it drives the formation of the growth cone. To help us find out the relationship between this local actin fluctuation and neural growth, extract the neural growth profiles over time, as well as the local actin intensity at the neural tip, neural shaft, and the soma, and then apply the cross-correlation analysis to find out the relationship among this measurement. And when we put all these cross-correlation profiles together, it shows that there's a certain temporally ordered cross-correlations between the local actin fluctuations with the neural growth. And this nicely captures these cycles of a local actin event and their coupling with the neural growth as summarized below. So a neuron begins with a very high actin intensity at the soma mediated by those actin patches. And out of which this actin wave then emerge at the soma. And this also reduces those actin patch intensity. And then this actin wave then translocate along the neural shaft. Once it arrives at the neural tip, it's transformed into this growth cone and drive the neural extension. At the same time, the actin intensity at the soma then gradually increase again, and this will sequester those actin filaments from the neural tip, and this triggers a neural retraction and initiate another round of neural growth oscillation. So then the next question here is, what could be the factors mediating such a neural growth and a local actin fluctuation coupling? So there are several clues directing our attention to this up-to-3 complex, which is a nucleator for this actin branching network. So these neuronal actin patches are structurally very similar to those actin foci or actin esters found in other different kind of cell types like these embryonic stem cells. And we know that they are driven by this up-to-3 complex. And second clue is that we know that this neural growth associated actin structures, the growth cone and actin waves, they are abundant with laminipodia. And we also know this laminipodia is driven by the up-to-3 complex. And it also has been known that up-to-3 is implicated in this neural growth regulation. But different labs, somehow they give a different result, different conclusion. But overall, it's indicated that indeed the up-to-3 complex is involved in neural growth, although whether the mechanism behind is still unclarified. So given by this information, we hypothesize that up-to-3 may mediate this coupling between the local actin fluctuation and neural growth oscillation. So to test this possibility, I first checked the up-to-3 localization in a neuron. So in this immunostaining, you can see that indeed this up-to-3 complex not only localized at the growth cone, but it also nicely co-localized with those actin patches along the neural shaft and also at the soma. And when we express this up-to-3 subunit fused with the fluorescence protein in a neuron, one can see that those up-to-3 actin patches, they emerge at the peripheral region of the growth cone, and then once they approach toward the transition region of the growth cone, then they disassemble or simply disappear. And in contrast to this directional high mobility of these up-to-3 patches at the growth cone, those up-to-3 patches at the soma, somehow they show limited mobility, and then overall they didn't show a very clear directionality. Then the next question is, okay, now we know up-to-3 localization in the neuron. Then what is its relationship with the neural growth? What is its role here? So to gain some clues to this answer, so we first check the colocalization. We did some colocalization analysis and cross-correlation analysis of these up-to-3 actin patches. and we try to find out what is exactly the relationship of the neuron growth. And it turns out that an extending neurite is frequently associated with the increase of these obtusely acting patches. And conversely, a retracting neurite is associated with the reduction of these obtusely patches. And indeed, the quantitative analysis of these cross correlations between neurite growth and this obtusely acting intensity, it shows that there's a strong positive correlations between the local obtusely acting intensities and with the neuron extension velocity. So with this cross-correlation result on hand, the next question is there really causality? So what will happen if we just get rid of this obtusely from the neuron? So to achieve this, we generate mouse embryos with obtusely knockout brain. So as you can see that this knockout can efficiently deplete the whole obtusely complex at the protein level. And when we did the immunostaining of a brain section, you can also see that there's a severe reduction of the overall axonal tract in the knockout. And when we did the in utero electroporation to sparsely label individual neurons, and this allows us to nicely see the individual neuronal morphology, you can also see that there's indeed a severe axonal formation defect. And such an axon formation defect remains true when we isolated neuron and culture them on Petri dish. So overall, this result indicate that indeed the obtusely knockout is sufficient to abrogate the neural polarization by blocking the axon formation. Then the next question is why? Why does a neuron require obtusely to generate axon? Because after all, it's just a nuclear actin branching. Why is actin branching so important for axon formation and neurite growth? So to find out clues to this answer, I start checking the actin organization in a neuron. So quite very logic next step. So you can see that the obtusely knockout abrogate all those obtusely dependent actin structures, including the growth cone, actin wave, and actin patches. And in the knockout instead, those actin structures were replaced by those adjoint filopodia. And these joint filopodia were frequently interconnected at the base of this filopodia. We call this structure interfilopodia junction. So to get more information, to give us some information about this actin ultrastructure, then I analyze the electrotomogram of the actin networks at the wild-type growth cone and knockout neuron tip. So in this tomogram, one can see that indeed, in the knockout actin networks, you can see that we couldn't identify any actin branching point in a tomogram of the knockout. So this totally makes sense, and it's also expected. But another more interesting information here is that while the actin alignment in the wild type and knockout, they present very different actin organization. So in the wild type, you can see that the overall actin configuration presents a polarized directionality with their bob end uniformly pointing toward the leading edge. However, in the knockout, you can see that the actin configuration presents a bipolarized angle distribution. So then what does that mean? Actually, this bipolarized angle distribution is an indication of the increase of the ectomyosin network. As we know, the ectomyosin is the configuration of ectomyosin is an anti-parallel actin bundles. So in the wild-type growth cone, this anti-parallel ectomyosin is assembled by an actin motor protein myosin 2. And this ectomyosin arc at the transition region blocks the advance of microtubules toward the peripheral region. And to drive the neural elongation and for the formation of axon, a neuron need a mechanism to overcome this barrier and then drive the neural growth. So with this information, it raises the possibility that somehow in our upstream knockout neurons, it leads to the increase of the dominance of ectomyosin in this knockout neuron, and eventually it blocks it restrains the neural growth and blocks the axon formation. So to test this possibility, so again, I just first check the myosin 2 localization in the neuron. So as you can see that in this is a video showing a neuron expressing the UP3 fused with the fluorescence protein as well as a myosin-2 light chain to visualize the myosin-2 behavior. So you can see that at the growth cone, the myosin-2 light chain and UP3, they present as a patch-like structures and they occupy distinct regions in the growth cone. So you can see that this myosin-2 occupy a transition region, while UP3 patches occupy the peripheral region. And at the soma, you can also see that although these myosin-2 and UP3 patches, they don't occupy the very distinct domains, but still, those UP3 patches and myosin-2 patches that present as a specially segregated patches, they don't overlap with each other. So, and then I performed a colocalization analysis, and you can also see that indeed consistent with our visual impression that you can see at both growth cone and the soma, the colocalization level of the UP3 myosin-2 light chain is lower than the actin UP3 colocalization. And then next I test whether this endogenous localization of myosin-2 with this immunostaining. You can also see that even also with this immunostaining, you can see this myosin-2 localization at the growth cone. And these myosin-2 patches were excluded from the peripheral region of the growth cone. And in contrast, in a knockout, you can see these myosin-2 patches can penetrate deeply along the phytopodia bundles and occupy at the neural tip in a knockout. And in a wild-type soma, you can also see that the actin patches and myosin-2 patches, they present a complementary localization. In contrast, in the knockout soma, you see these myosin-2 patches, they really heavily dominate these disorganized actin networks. So, to directly test whether the myosin-2 activity is indeed the major cause of the phenotype we observed in the knockout, then I directly simply treated the neuron with a myosin-2 inhibitor Bradke study. So you can see that indeed the inhibition of myosin-2 activity with the Bradke study can very effectively rescue the knockout phenotype and brought axon formation back. Importantly, such a rescue didn't recover all those UP3 dependent actin structures, including the growth cone. This indicates that in the absence of myosin-2 activity, actually the neural growth and axon formation can bypass the requirement of UP3, can bypass the requirement of actin branching. Okay, that's the first important information. And the second important information revealed here is that myosin-2 inhibition with the Bradke study induced multiple axons in both wild-type and knockout neurons. And this clearly demonstrates that the UP3 and myosin-2, they play exactly opposite roles in neural growth and axon formation. And this nicely fits the theoretical positive and negative regulators we propose in this local excitation global inhibition system ensuring a single axon formation. Okay. So the above results demonstrate that, okay, indeed, the knockout phenotype, this neuronal polarization defect in knockout is caused by the global increased dominance of ectomyosin. It also raises the possibility that maybe the UP3, by generating a very different actin geometries, it can act as a direct negative regulators of myosin-2, because we know the myosin-2 is featured with anti-parallel ectomyosin bundles. Okay, so to directly test this possibility, I treated the neuron with an UP3 inhibitor CK666. What I want to see is how would this acute UP3 inhibition would impact neural growth and ectomyosin behavior. So this is the video of a neuron before and after UP3 inhibition. So you can see that it's not only induced with dramatic actin reorganization, but such reorganization was also accompanied with a global neural retraction. So this indicates that the UP3 activities is not only important for the neurite extension, but it's also important for the maintenance of the neurite shaft stability and prevent neurite retraction. And to really see that how does the up-to-3 influence the ectomyosin behavior, in this video I show a neuron expressing the myosin 2 regulatory light chain. So you can see that accompanied with the global neurite retraction, you can also see that the up-to-3 inhibition also increase the ectomyosin contraction. And this such an increase of ectomyosin contraction then leads to the formation of a large ectomyosin condensate. They pull each other and also pull the actin mass from along the neuron shaft, and eventually they merge at the soma. So this clearly demonstrates that yes, the up-to-3 activity is really important for the maintenance of the neuron shaft stability. And this also indicates that actually the ectomyosin at different sites in the neuron, they are not just independent, totally isolated actin networks. Actually, these actin networks at different places in neuron, they are interconnected. They are interconnected. Okay. Then the next question is, then why does the increase of the ectomyosin contraction eventually lead to this global neurite retraction, right? So we know that the microtubules along the neurite shaft act as kind of a backbone supporting the stability of the neurite. So the increase of the ectomyosin contraction could apply a severe compression force on the microtubules. So based on this simple idea, we propose that maybe the interaction between the microtubules and ectomyosin could establish a tensegrity system. And this up-to-3, by modulating the ectomyosin contractility and the stability, it can pivot the dynamics of a neurite growth to either extension or retraction. Okay. So indeed, supporting our hypothesis, we found that accompanying with the global neurite retraction, we observe a severe compression of microtubules along the neuron shaft. And in addition, we also observed that such an increase of such a global neurite retraction also accompanied with a dramatic reduction of overall polymerizing microtubules level, visualized with this EB3 binding protein. Okay, so now I guess I hope most of the audience are convinced that the up-to-3 activities and myosin 2, its interaction with the myosin 2, indeed control the neurite growth oscillation, the two arms of neurite growth oscillation, the extension and the retraction. Okay, then to directly test whether up-to-3 activities can indeed directly antagonize ectomyosin, next I apply the optogenetic approach. So in this approach, I use an established photoactivatable reg-1 constructs. So upon the photoactivation, it allows us to locally activate the up-to-3 activity and generate actin branching. So in this video, you can clearly see that upon the photoactivation, it not only leads to the formation of laminipodia, but at the same time, it also efficiently disassembles ectomyosin arc. And very importantly, such a disassembly is only transient. As you can see that upon the removal of a light, this ectomyosin arc can quickly reassemble. So this indicates that without a sustainable up-to-3 activities, the myosin 2 can quickly regain its dominance on the actin network and eventually lead to the reassembly of ectomyosin. And supporting our hypothesis is indeed that when we locally activate up-to-3 activities at different places in a neuron, like in the growth cone, we found although the activation of growth cone induces the neural extension, but such extension is very limited. And also, especially when we activate those up-to-3 activity at the soma, you can, instead of induce the neural extension, actually it's boost the local ectomyosin contraction, and eventually it leads to the retraction of this neighboring neurite. and to further support that the local up-to-3 activity is indeed required for the maintenance of a neural shaft stability. I also use a dominant negative version of PA-REC1, and you can clearly see that upon the photoactivation of this dominant negative version of PA-REC1, it suppresses the local up-to-3 activity, and eventually this leads to a neural retraction. Okay. So, in summary, we found that the up-to-3 dictate the formation of those actin structures associated with the neural growth. These actin patches is actin wave and the growth cone. And the interactions of this up-to-3 and ectomyosin, they dictate these two arms of the neural growth oscillation, the extension and the retraction. And this locally activate up-to-3 by modulating the ectomyosin and suppress the local ectomyosin assembly and contractility. It allows the neuron to extend, and when the neuron fails to sustain this up-to-3 activity, it would lead to a neural retraction. And such an interaction between up-to-3 and ectomyosin also leads to these various patterns, their spatial segregations we observe in a neuron. Like what we observe in the growth cone, we see this distinct dominance of this up-to-3 and myosin 2 activity, their localization in the transition region and the peripheral region. And at soma, we observe that they occupy as distinct patch-like structures. And then, by modulating ectomyosin activities, the up-to-3 pivot the tensegrity systems established by these microtubules and ectomyosin interactions. So it can change the neural growth from the extension activity then to the retraction activity. So at the end of my talk, I'd like to thank my colleagues of Bradke Lab, especially Charlotte and Kevin. They really pioneered the work of up-to-3 and the actin patches. And for the beautiful EM work, we have really successful collaboration with the Schur group in IST Austria. And for the deep learning assisted image processing, we had collaboration with Christoph. And also for actin polarity determination, we had a collaboration with Akihiro Narita in Japan. And of course, I also need to thank our animal facility and image microscope, light microscope facility. They really have very nice patience with my various kind of requests. And sometimes they are really my request is really annoying. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. So as a dean, I'm really very glad to know that our analysts developed so well in German. Okay, so so let's open for questions.
Well, so I'm just curious, like, does up-to-3 play a role in the determination of axon? Since among neurons, the longest one becomes axon. Does up-to-3 play a role in that?
Yes, so we think that up-to-3 play a role in the axon determination in a way that it's really required for the neural elongation. So we think that this is its modulation is a regulatory role on these ectomyosin networks. And eventually we know, based on our model, if there's just actin network and it's just regulated between this ectomyosin and up-to-3, this would lead to a constant fluctuation of this neuronal polarity. So although it will always be like just a single axon, but the axon identity can be this one, and next time point could be that one. To solve this problem, we think it would also require certain stabilization mechanism. And we think this mechanism is... Yes, so eventually the microtubules can stabilize the polarity with the axon identity to just that single neurite. So it's also explained why no matter you treat the neuron with acting network interference agent or like a cyto-DS fragmentation, or you treat the neuron with the taxol, it's all have a great impact on the neural polarity, right? So we think to ensure that single axon formation and to fix the axon identity is required this synergy and a collaboration between the microtubules and actin.
Any question?
Just follow the question by Professor Yu Zhenya. That so what if you don't stop the light for the RAC1 optogenetics approach? What will be the fate of the cell?
We tried that, but unfortunately, we couldn't efficiently lead to neural elongation. Actually, it's eventually due to the phototoxicity, it would lead to neuron death.
Okay, because actually I'm working on microbes, and one of the organism in my laboratory is Listeria. And we know that Listeria expresses a risk factor called ACT-A. It can nucleate up to 3, and therefore to induce the polymerization of up to 3. So I don't know, because we also discussed that whether the up to 3 complex is important for the axon growth. So I'm just curious that if it seems that there at some point we need to stop the complex formation, so at which point the complex needs to be disassembled, and which pathway would regulate the assembling versus disassembling of up to 3 complex in the axon development?
I think during this very early stage, you will constantly need up to 3 activities. And especially since you can imagine that it's constantly fluctuating, it still need a very strong neural elongation activity, right? Eventually it can develop axon. And we also know at a later stage, the dendrite, lost minor neurite, they also will grow out, right? So we believe this will require up to 3 activity. And overall, even once the neuron mature and also develop the synapse with its interaction with the other neurons, I believe the up to 3 activity is also required because it needs a mechanism to stabilize the actin networks. Otherwise, you can imagine without up to 3, the ectomyosin, so without up to 3, okay, you can imagine there will be an increase of the anti-parallel ectomyosin network. Now, how would you stabilize those actin ectomyosin, right?
Yeah, I agree it's very important to have this complex, the activity is complex. But I'm curious that, do we need this to be constitutively activated, or at some point we need to inactivate it in order to make sure the cell will stay in a good shape?
For example, you can imagine in a physiological situation, not only need the neurite to grow, but you also need the neurite to target its specific regions to have this correct wire. So you can imagine that by suppressing the up to 3 activity, it can control, it can a kind of negative regulation. So it can prevent the up to 3 to prevent the neurite grow to that direction, and then eventually promote the neurite growth to the other direction. Right. So in this way, you can. So we believe that the main function of the growth cone is not to provide is not a machinery for neural elongation. For neural elongation, by the cyto-D experiment, we already show that it doesn't need the machinery there. But we believe the growth cone, the main function of the growth cone is for guidance. So through the growth cone, it can sense. By sensing these external factors, it can locally modulate the up to 3 activities, so eventually can drive the turning of the growth cone to this direction and that direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so I think now it's a little bit late, and before I close out this session, I want to ask Tien-Chen, can you say something to our undergrad and graduate students? I think you are a very good role model, so try to say something to encourage our undergraduate PhD student?
For the undergraduate and also the PhD student overall in this university or general, or maybe you are from other university, before you make your commitment to science and or to which field, think carefully. Think carefully what you want to. Not because it's not
sounds a little bit scary.
But think carefully what is really your interest? What's your enthusiasm? Because you can imagine it's a really quite a long path. If you really want to pursue the academic career, it's a long path. So don't just because you think, okay, the Harvard or University of Harvard, don't just go there simply because of those big names. Think about what you want to do. Think about which area in biology, which question really interests you. I think that is really the most important thing, because think about it, you will carry this enthusiasm, carry those questions with you for such a long time. If you don't such a strong enthusiasm and motivation, it's very likely you will give up in the middle, and that's really a shame. Let's say not a shame, but it's really a pity that you already input so much time, and eventually maybe eventually you will still get some certain skill or some knowledge for different career path, or that's all good. But if you really want to pursue the academic career path, so think about those questions carefully. Okay, it doesn't, no matter how much time you take to think about those questions, think it through is very, very important. And I think that's the major point I can give you.
The last short question for you. I was often asked the same question. So, why did you choose to study PhDs in German?
So, based on my personal experience, before I tried to apply the program in US as also in Germany, because at that time I really don't know which country I want to go. I simply just try to explore all different possibilities. And eventually I got an offer from the UT Austin, and then the other one is from the Heidelberg. And then I really asked many professors and also my parents how they think. Do you think maybe US is suitable for me, or you think due to this culture different things, which culture maybe is suitable for better fit with my personality? And it turns out that the most important determining factor for me to choose Germany is really that the laboratory who gave me the offer, the research really attracted me. And then before I went there, I studied I studied this in vitro reconstitution of microtubules. And then in that laboratory, they studied microtubules embodied yeast. So for me, it's really a nice fit, and I can keep going to continue this research to that direction with my already collected information and background knowledge. So eventually, yeah, that's the reason. Maybe another reason is that compared to the food in US, maybe the food in Germany are more healthy, and they don't have a little super XXL size of the steak, and also a hamburger. No.
So you like beer and sausage?
They also have a salad. Okay.
Someone may disagree, right?
And that's also my parents. They were really worried about this my diet in a foreign country. So I think that's also part of the factors make me to make this decision. Yeah.
Okay. I like a Schweinhaxen. Okay. So now let's close this session. Let's thank Tien-Chen and Frank. Thank you. Sorry, I forgot. I need to give them is a certificate, right? It's a kind of appreciation. So they made the English version for you, but I think no. We should to give you. We should also try to prepare the Chinese version, because you don't know what we write. but maybe it's more interesting for you. You can frame it.
Come here.
Okay, let's come here. Where?
那时候我还在生化所，他就被生化所踢出来。
看起来你很好玩，还是去外国有？